Have you ever wondered, why is there something rather than nothing? Might there have been nothing? No universe at all? Maybe no monkeys to entertain us? Nor would we see graceful horses or experience the coldness of a snowstorm, or wonderful architecture created by our ancestors. No beautiful flowers. No philosophy fans grazing the fields. There might have been nothing whatsoever. Given that there is something, we know that we exist, how tight is our grip on that reality? Might we disappear in an instant? It's enough to turn a man to drink. Have you got nothing to say? You could at least put on your Guinness t-shirt. Hello. Now, in one of my earlier videos, I discussed various philosophical topics. I thought I'd do another video, this time about a specific philosophical topic, why there is something rather than nothing. Now, my intended audience is simply people who are interested in discussing these type of issues. I'm not particularly targeting professional philosophers. So I'm going to be speaking in very general terms, just to try to convey a flavour of some of the issues that philosophers like to talk about. Now, I thought I'd go for a walk around Leeds city centre and perhaps up to the university there whilst discussing this topic, because I always like to go for a healthy walk. Now, in discussing this topic, why is there something rather than nothing, I will be looking at some aspects which are quite complex. I think for the layperson who's interested in popular philosophy, like someone's interested in popular science, then it may sound a bit esoteric and bit too complicated. I mean, fair enough, probably I'm not explaining it well enough. It is complex. So if you don't quite follow certain aspects or they interest you less, fine. Please admire the beautiful sculptures in Leeds city centre. At Leeds railway station, after a reasonably pleasant journey, I noticed at the side of the building this. Some people would call it artwork, some people would call it graffiti. As I step out of the railway station, already a group of prospective philosophy students has gathered. Leeds city centre is replete with some beautiful architecture and many interesting statues. As I walk through the city centre, I will discuss philosophy and only occasionally point out some particular buildings or statues that I find especially interesting. Otherwise, I will annotate the screen. As always in philosophy, we should define our terms. What do we mean by nothing? Well, how about this as a thought experiment? Let us remove all the concrete objects in the universe, all the rabbits, pizzas, planets, stars, and radiation. By concrete objects, I roughly mean objects that have causal power. They do things. In a sense, if you kick them, they kick you back. Now, do we have nothing? No, arguably we still have space and time. I say arguably because perhaps space and time do not exist independently as substances, but are derivative on all those concrete objects we've just removed. Let's set that issue aside. Let us remove space and time. At this point, a physicist such as Lawrence Krauss, if I understand him correctly, would say we have nothing, and that a universe can come from such nothingness. But we still have the quantum realm, so Krauss's universe is appearing from the quantum realm, which is a something, and that quantum realm is governed by quantum laws of nature, which again is a something. Let's remove the quantum realm with its laws of nature. Must be nothing now. However, perhaps we have immaterial concrete objects such as God. Let's remove God. You might object that God cannot be removed. I'm not making any deliberate play here on what God is, if God exists. But yes, on the traditional understanding, it would seem that it is not metaphysically possible to remove God. If that is true, then we have our answer as to why there's something rather than nothing. There's God. Talking about removing things, here in the Trinity shopping centre, I've come across Equus Altus, or High Horse. This is a magnificent statue of a horse suspended from the glass atrium of the shopping centre. It was created by Scottish artist Andy Scott, and it is meant to reflect the importance of the wool and textile industry in Leeds. It would be such a tragedy to have to remove this magnificent horse, but the demands of philosophy are harsh. At least for the purposes of this thought experiment, we can remove God. If you remove God, surely there must be nothing left now. Well, what about abstract objects, such as mathematical facts that 2 + 2 = 4, or a logical fact, such as the law of identity, something is identical with itself? These would seem to be true even if you do not have any concrete objects to apply them to. A universe might not exist, but if it were to exist, it would still be the case that 2 apples + 2 apples make 4 apples. It would still be the case that God is identical with God. Not too far from the Trinity shopping centre, I came across another group of prospective philosophy students. These prospective students seem to be precociously wise. Okay, back to abstract objects. You might object that these abstract objects are in some sense ideas in the mind of God. So, in removing God, you remove the abstract objects. On the other hand, maybe they are independent of God. Even God would have to conform to the laws of logic. God cannot both be God and not be God at the same instant in the same way. Let us remove abstract objects then. Must be nothing now. What about possibilities? Perhaps it is the possibility that God exists. Perhaps it is the possibility that a concrete universe could exist. It is hard to see how you could ever remove possibilities. And yet, possibilities are profoundly mysterious. How is it that there are possibilities, if indeed there are possibilities? What makes it true that there are possibilities? If you go back to the earlier point about abstract objects, and you claim that everything comes from God, so even possibilities come from God, well, if you accept that there's the possibility that God exists, and that possibility is derived from God, for that's where possibilities reside, so to speak, that would be question begging, for it would presuppose God's existence. Possibilities are very strange. Now, at this point already, your head might be hurting, so maybe take another sip of Guinness. Explanation has to stop somewhere. In discussing the question of why there is something rather than nothing, it is useful to keep in mind what you would consider an acceptable stopping point at which you could explain the existence of everything else. You might consider the universe itself to be a suitable stopping point. You might consider it to be the quantum laws of nature. You might consider it to be God. Or you might consider it to be abstract objects, or perhaps mere possibilities. It would be useful to have some helping hands in this matter. I think I'll start to make my way to Leeds University. Bound to be plenty of helping hands there. At the very least, it will inspire me. As I make my way there, I pass an informal bar and cafe in the student area called the dry dock. Isn't that excellent? Let's get a little bit more rigorous in our philosophizing. Let us say that an entity is something that exists. We can say that an entity is either necessary or contingent in its existence. By that I mean, if an entity is necessary, it cannot fail to exist. It cannot not exist. That is, it must exist. On the other hand, if an entity is contingent, then it can fail to exist. That is, it does not have to exist. The explanation for why a necessary entity exists is found within itself. That is, it is either self-caused or its very essence, its nature, is identical with its existence. Existence is, as it were, baked into it. It appears to be illogical that something can be self-caused. Like I was talking about possibility in God, and we say it's possible that God exists, but that presupposes God's existence. Similarly, if something is self-caused, it would have to exist prior to itself in order to cause itself. That seems absurd. So, how something has this necessity is deeply mysterious, and we simply may not have an answer. It seems to be a brute fact that something simply is. Something is simply necessary. There is no further explanation. Here I am at Leeds University's campus, having a pleasant walk around. Now, in seeking an explanation for something, we need to be careful that we don't oversimplify. Intuitively, we feel the simpler the explanation, the better it must be. This doesn't necessarily follow. So, for instance, I'm reminded of the joke, often attributed to physicists, about them oversimplifying models. A farmer was experiencing problems with the milk production, and he invited the local university to investigate what was troubling his cows. So the university sent out a group of physicists. The physicists spent several weeks investigating, collected their data, went back to the university, wrote their report. In the report, the physicists said, well, we know what the problem is, and we know how to solve it. However, we've been working on the basis of two assumptions. The first assumption is that the cows are spherical, and the second assumption is that they live in a vacuum. So again, if we have a necessary entity, then we have an answer as to why there's something rather than nothing. We have something because that something is a necessary entity, and it could not fail to be. A contingent entity, on the other hand, is an entity whose reason for its existence is found outside of itself. We could say it does not have within itself the resources to exist. It is merely possible. It is, as it were, balanced between existence and non-existence, and it needs something outside of itself to tip the balance in favour of existence. So what can tip a contingent or possible entity into existence? Perhaps another contingent entity. If A is caused by B, both A and B are contingent entities, then we have an explanation for A. It was caused by B. But you might reasonably ask, well, B also is contingent. So what caused B? And I could say B was caused by C, another contingent entity. What caused C? Of course, C was caused by D. All right, what was D caused by? And I could say another contingent entity, E. Now, in a sense, we do have a chain of explanation of A, B, C, D, and E. And you might be happy with that local explanation. It's local in the sense of you're just asking why A, why B, why C, why D. And this idea of a local explanation works well in some areas of life. Let's say, for example, you're wondering about your ancestry. You might be satisfied with where you came from, in the sense of, well, you came from your parents came from your grandparents, and your grandparents came from your great-grandparents. And given that maybe that's as far back as the records go, you might be happy enough with that explanation. That's plenty of people to fill a family tree. You wouldn't say, well, I want to know where the great-grandparents came from, and where the great-great-grandparents came from, and where the great-great-great-grandparents came from, all the way back to, shall we say, Adam and Eve. But perhaps you're not satisfied. You do want to go back as far back as would provide a global or complete explanation. But let's say each step along the way involves a contingent entity. So it seems that we end up in an infinite regress. We never come to a stopping point. Now, infinite regresses are usually considered to be vicious, not benign. One reason it is vicious is because we've not provided that global explanation as to why we have this infinite series. Yes, you have a local explanation for A, but you do not have one for the whole chain. Some philosophers argue that you cannot have an actual infinity anyway, and so they would dismiss the idea of an infinite chain of contingent entities. They would say that there has to be a beginning from which you start your traversing, and this beginning has to be necessary. It has to have existence baked into itself, so to speak, so that it can tip the contingent chain of entities into existence. Think about dominoes. So think of a single domino. It's a bit like a contingent entity. It's balance between existence and non-existence. It needs something to tip it over into existence. So we have a second domino. But the second domino is not tipping the first domino into existence yet, because it itself is merely possible, it's merely contingent. It too is balanced and needs to tip into existence before it can tip the following domino. Okay, maybe we need a third domino then. They're still not tipping into existence. Maybe another one? No? Another one? No? And so on. You can see that we're going to end up with an infinite series. And no matter how far back in infinity we go, no domino gets tipped into existence. So the argument would be that you need a beginning. You cannot traverse an infinity. You need a beginning to tip the first domino into existence, and that will multiply through and knock over the other dominoes. So that first entity must be a necessary existent. It must have existence. It cannot fail to exist. And that enables it then to push over the other dominoes. And it worked. And of course, a popular choice for this necessary existent would be God. Would you like to start off the universe? Thank you. When we look at the universe we live in, the contents certainly appear to be causally dependent upon other entities, and so are contingent. If we understand the universe as the totality of all those contingent contents, then we may infer that the universe itself is contingent. That is, the total, the universe, takes on the properties of the parts. We have to be cautious here, though. In that inference, we might be committing what philosophers call the fallacy of composition. It's not always the case that the total has the properties of the parts. I might make a house out of small bricks. The house itself will not be small. In other words, the universe might in fact be necessary, even though it is a totality of contingent contents. The universe existence might simply be a brute fact. It just simply is. No explanation, full stop. Bertrand Russell, for instance, argued this in the famous 1948 BBC radio debate with Frederick Copperston. He said, "I should say that the universe is just there, and that's all." Now, that might strike you as deeply unsatisfactory. Most people have intuitions that there is a reason for everything. This is reflected in what is known in philosophy as the principle of sufficient reason. The philosopher Gottfried Leibniz stated it as, "Nothing takes place without a sufficient reason." Well, it's time for me to finish my walk around Leeds University's campus. This principle, or the PSR, is not simply that there is a reason, but that there is a sufficient reason. If we subscribe to the PSR, then we think there is a sufficient reason for the universe's existence. We reject bruteness. It is quite plausible that the universe is contingent because the parts are contingent. If the universe is defined as the totality of contingent parts, then the universe would require something outside of itself to bring it into existence. And that something outside of itself cannot be contingent. Our definition is that the universe is the totality of contingent parts. So if something outside the universe is contingent, well, actually being a contingent thing, it would be within the universe. So the entity outside the universe causing the contingent universe or the contingent parts to come into existence must be a necessary entity. As a necessary entity, it cannot be within the universe because that would mean that the universe was self-caused. And we've already said that that's absurd. We have a remarkable conclusion. We know that if we encounter something that exists, it's either necessary or contingent. If it's necessary, we know why there's something rather than nothing. If it's a contingent entity, we know that the contingent entity in itself isn't able to come into existence. It had to be tipped into existence by a necessary entity at the beginning of the causal chain. So the mere fact that something exists entails that there is a necessary entity. Does this mean that we have proved the existence of God? No, we've only proved the existence of a necessary entity. What that necessary entity is, for example, one of the stopping points I mentioned earlier. If we want to go on to prove the existence of God, we need additional arguments. Out of the blackness comes the light. It may be a contingent matter whether you have enjoyed this video. I hope you have. If you have, it is necessary for you to give it a thumbs up, and it is also necessary for you to subscribe. See you in the next video.